The Pachuco Era by Jackie Gonzalez. What is the Pachuco Era? This was a time in the United States history during the 1930s to 50s. Pachucos themselves were said to be juvenile gang members from the rough ages of 13 to 22. Most of these so-called gang members were young men or young boys. Yet many people wore this style of clothing, this Pachuco style. There were many adults as well as many women who wore this style. While the women did have their own twist on this, many of it was not prominently known the same way the men were, which is very unfortunate. Their style was very interesting. It had a twist that had never been seen before. Many of these juveniles were dressed in baggy pants as well as a matching blazer that was also way too big for this person. There were many other variations that these people wore, but this was the most basic of the basic for this specific style. While not every Pachuco was related in any gang-related fashion, they were given harsh labels such as being untrustworthy, gang members, violent, dangerous, and thieves. And this deeply affected the communities where the Pachucos were prominent members of society and prominent members of the community. What is the Pachuco Era? This was a time in the United States history during the 1930s to 50s. Pachucos themselves were said to be juvenile gang members from the rough ages of 13 to 22. Most of these so-called gang members were young men or young boys. Yet many people wore this style of clothing, this Pachuco style. There were many adults as well as many women who wore this style. While the women did have their own twist on this, many of it was not prominently known the same way the men were, which is very unfortunate. Their style was very interesting. It had a twist that had never been seen before. Many of these juveniles were dressed in baggy pants as well as a matching blazer that was also way too big for this person. There were many other variations that these people wore, but this was the most basic of the basic for this specific style. While not every Pachuco was related in any gang-related fashion, they were given harsh labels. I actually have some familial ties to the Pachuco era. I actually have a great uncle who was a Pachuco. The six people shown in the picture, going from left to right from the row with all the men and then to the women. The first row it is my tío Ramon, my tata, my tío Beto, my tia Josie, my tia Lala, and then finally my tia Margie. My tío Ramundo is actually the older brother to the people shown mom. So it's their uncle, essentially. My great tío Ramundo was actually born in Miami, Arizona, which is, fun fact, the copper center of the world. Um, since he was born in Arizona, they ended up moving to California during the Roaring 20s. So about a century ago, they moved to California. They moved to East LA, and that is when my tío Ramundo ended up getting into the culture of the Pachucos and kind of dressing the same way they do, wearing baggy pants, a white shirt, always very clean and dressed up. His hair always slicked back, and overall, he looked like a Pachuco. He looked like a zoot suitor, just a little low budgeted because this family was very poor at this time, despite it being the Roaring 20s. And then once the Great Depression actually hit, they were forced to move back to Arizona. Not really Arizona, they moved back to Mexico because they just couldn't sustain living in East LA, and then they couldn't just survive out there. They were the only ones that were out there in their families, so they just wanted to be around family and around people that they knew would help take care of them and the kids. So my Tío Raimundo and the family ended up moving back when he was about 17. It actually was also right before like World War II hit, so they were also very concerned about him getting drafted, and they were just scared for that. So they moved back to Mexico slash Arizona, and throughout that time they would go to Magdalena and kind of see the family from down there, and they would actually travel in like these wagons. They had a cow and a horse that they would take with them, and then mostly they walked most of the way there. At the beginning of World War II, that is when they decided to have the boys stay in Mexico just so they wouldn't be drafted, because a lot of the young men in their family had already been drafted, and it just was not being a good place for them. They kept not making it back home, so they were just worried. They wanted to protect their own, and so they did. His life was very, very interesting. He kept the look of a Pachuco man throughout his entire life. He ended up passing away when he was 83 years old. And my dad actually has memories of him riding his bike from Nogales all the way to Tucson because he did not want to learn how to drive. I think my family thinks it has more to do with the fact that it was a very expensive thing to buy a car and to sustain having a car, because those are a lot of expenses, and they used to be a very poor family who could barely get food onto the table. And he was a very proud man. He ended up moving back to California. He moved to Mexicali for many, many years with his mom because that's where she wanted to be. But after the mom passed away, he stayed there. He worked at a radio shack, not like the store Radio Shack, but at kind of like a radio station type of thing. And then he ended up moving back to Nogales, Arizona about 40 years ago, because that is when, again, the siblings in the pictures mom got sick, so he just wanted to be there for his little sister. He didn't know how much time they would have together, and he ended up passing soon after the sister passed. And he is actually still very talked about in our family and still very important to our culture and kind of like our identity, and looking back at where we've been and where we are going. A significant event that defined the Pachuco era was the Zoot Suit riots. These riots were violent and harmed many, many people. Yet these riots were also very racially based. The people that were a part of the Zoot Suit riots were Navy sailors that were essentially all white men, and the Pachucos, who were all Mexican and or were of Hispanic descent. These riots were centrally in East LA. So many of the Pachucos were native to the LA area, and many of these sailors were not. They were simply stationed in the LA area. The media made the Pachucos out to be the people that were the instigators and the ones that were the cause of all of these problems, while they were simply the victims. The Navy sailors would jump and humiliate Pachucos of all ages and all genders. They would humiliate the women Pachucos and children as well for simply wearing the zoot suits. These zoot suits were just nice pants, bigger pants, that would essentially make them seem like they had more money than they did. Usually, they would pair these suits with a white shirt and a matching blazer to match the pants. They were very outlandish, but it was just something that they decided to do in order to feel like they were a part of the community, a part of this country, and they were harassed for it. Many of the Pachucos were hurt and put into jail for simply trying to defend themselves, trying to be able to go places safely. And the effects of this era and these riots are still being felt by the Hispanic and the brown population of this country. The impact of the Pachuco era would be something that would have lasting effects, spreading all the way to today. Even today, throughout the country, minority communities have a distrustful relationship with the police department, while Hispanics and Latinos are still given harsh stereotypes of being in gangs, being violent and dangerous, as well as being untrustworthy and unworthy of being in a country like the United States. While the effects of this time period are highlighted in our everyday society, there are improvements and lives that these people that had gone through this era could have never even dreamt about. The impact of the Pachuco era would be something that would have lasting effects, spreading all the way to today. Even today, throughout the country, minority communities have a distrustful relationship with the police department, while Hispanics and Latinos are still given harsh stereotypes of being in gangs, being violent and dangerous, as well as being untrustworthy and unworthy of being in a country like the United States. While the effects of this time period are highlighted in our everyday society, there are improvements